The jar came up out of the ground still sealed, a meter tall, red clay baked hard by 15 centuries of desert. 4 small handles near the neck, and across the lid a black crust of something like tar, poured on deliberately by a hand long dead. Whoever buried this did not want it opened by accident. The man standing over it was called Muhammad Ali. He was not an archaeologist. He was a farmer, out at the base of a cliff with his brothers and their camels, digging for soft soil to spread on his fields. He had been looking for dirt. He had found this instead, and now he was afraid to touch it, because there is an old belief in that part of Upper Egypt. A sealed vessel, buried, hidden, is not empty. A jinn might live inside, a spirit. Break the seal and you let it out, and whatever comes out is yours to answer for. He stood there with a mattock in his hands. Then he thought about gold. A jar this size, sealed this carefully, buried at the foot of a cliff riddled with ancient tombs. Maybe it wasn't a spirit at all. Maybe it was treasure. Maybe someone 1,500 years ago had hidden something worth more than his whole life, and left it here, waiting for him. Hope beat fear. It usually does. He raised the mattock and brought it down. The jar shattered, and something golden burst up into the light and hung in the air. For 1 second he must have thought he was rich. He wasn't. What he was watching drift on the wind were tiny flakes of gold-coloured papyrus, catching the sun as they fell. Not treasure, paper, old, crumbling, ordinary paper. Muhammad Ali had no idea what he was looking at. He could not read, neither could his brothers. So they did not know. They could not have known that they had just opened one of the most dangerous discoveries of the 20th century. That inside this cracked jar were 13 books. That those books had been sealed in the ground on purpose by people who were being hunted. And that the words written across those brittle pages had been condemned 1,600 years earlier as something the world was never supposed to read. This is the story of what was in the jar. And it is also the story of what those books did to the men who found them. Because before scholars ever got their hands on these pages, before a single word was translated, this discovery would pass through a burning oven, a blood feud, a severed human heart, and a one-eyed outlaw on the black market of Cairo. The book survived all of it. Some of the people did not. Let's go back to that morning because the details matter more than they seem to. It was around December of 1945. The place was a cliff called the Jabal al-Tarif, a wall of pale rock rising out of the desert on the east bank of the Nile, about 7 miles from a town named Nag Hammadi. The cliff is honeycombed with caves and old tombs, the kind of place where the ancient dead were laid to rest, and the kind of place where, centuries later, a farmer might come to dig for sabak. Sabak is the soft, dark, nitrogen-rich soil that collects at the base of slopes like this. Free fertilizer, basically. You load it into the saddlebags of your camel, you carry it home, you spread it on your crops. Muhammad Ali and his brothers had done it 100 times. They tethered the camels to a big boulder and started digging around its base. That's when the mattock hit clay. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because it becomes important later. Almost everything we know about this moment comes from one source. Muhammad Ali himself, telling the story decades afterward to a scholar named James Robinson in the 1970s. And Muhammad Ali did not tell it the same way twice. In one version, there are 2 men at the cliff. In another, 7. In another, 8. Sometimes the jar is next to a boulder. Sometimes it's beside a body, a skeleton. Sometimes it's in a cave. The number of people, the exact spot, even who actually swung the mattock. It shifts every time he's asked. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to it, because the cracks in this story are one of the strangest parts of the whole thing. But the core stays consistent across every telling. A jar, a hesitation, a choice, and 13 leather-bound books carried home wrapped in cloth. He brought them back to his house in the village of Al-Qasr and dumped them in the yard near the oven. He had no use for them. To him they were junk. Old, water-stained, incomprehensible junk. His mother, though, found a use. She started tearing out pages and feeding them to the fire, kindling for the bread oven. Dry papyrus catches fast and burns hot, and to a woman baking flatbread for her family, that is exactly what those leaves were good for. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in that oven, in the smoke over a loaf of bread, are words no living person has read in 1,600 years, burned to ash before anyone could see them. We will never know how much was lost. A page, a chapter, an entire gospel gone up the chimney of a farmhouse in Upper Egypt because it made good fuel. That's the first thing this discovery teaches you. The line between survival and oblivion for these books was almost nothing. A change in the weather, a colder morning, a hungrier family, and we'd have nothing. But the fire is not the worst thing that happened in that village. Not even close. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what was already happening in Muhammad Ali's family before he ever found the jar. His father was dead. Murdered. The story goes that his father had been working as a guard and that he shot and killed an intruder on the land he was protecting. And in that region, in that time, a killing like that did not end in a courtroom. It ended in blood. The dead man's people were owed a death in return. That is how the feud worked. A life for a life, and the debt does not expire. The next morning, Muhammad Ali's father was found dead, shot in revenge, so now the debt ran the other way. Now it was Muhammad Ali and his brothers who were owed a killing, and they knew exactly who they believed was responsible, a man from a nearby town, the son of the person their father had killed. For months, nothing. The man they wanted was careful. He stayed away. And then, not long after the jar came out of the ground, word reached them. The man was asleep by the side of a road nearby, exhausted, unguarded. Their mother, the same woman who had been burning the pages, told her sons to keep their mattocks sharp. What happened next is difficult to hear. The brothers found him. They fell on him with those farming tools, the same kind of blade that had cracked the jar open, and they hacked him to death. And then, as the final act of vengeance, they cut out his heart, divided it between them, and ate it. I'm not dramatizing that. That is the account Muhammad Ali gave. That is the account scholars recorded. It is one of the most brutal footnotes attached to any archaeological find in history, and it happened within weeks of the discovery. In the same family, in the same village. Now here is where the books get pulled into the horror, because after a killing like that, the police come. And Muhammad Ali knew his house would be searched, and he suddenly had a problem. He had a jar's worth of strange old books in his yard. Books he now worried the authorities might seize or use against him, or simply take. Objects that might draw exactly the kind of official attention a wanted man cannot afford. So he got rid of them. He gave the books away. He handed some to a local priest for safekeeping. He let them scatter into the hands of neighbors, of anyone who'd take them off his property. And this is the detail that stops me every time. These 13 books had survived 16 centuries buried in a jar. They survived a mattock. They survived an oven. And now the thing that scattered them across Egypt, the thing that nearly destroyed them a second time, wasn't the ancient world at all. It was a murder. A blood feud in 1945 blew this collection apart and sent its pieces drifting onto the black market one at a time. The past didn't endanger these books. The present did. So where did they go? This is the part that plays out like a smuggling thriller, and almost none of it involves a scholar. Not yet. One of the codices ended up with a Coptic priest. Through his family, it made its way to Cairo. Other volumes fell into the hands of a man remembered in the accounts as Bahij Ali, described as a one-eyed outlaw from Muhammad Ali's own village, a man with nothing to lose who understood that these strange objects had value, even if he couldn't read a word of them. He took them to Cairo too, to the dealers, to the men who buy and sell the past in back rooms. And in one of those back rooms, an antiquities dealer named Phocion Tano recognized what was sitting in front of him. Tano didn't just buy what was offered. He went back to the Nag Hammadi region himself, hunting for more, sweeping up whatever pieces of the collection were still floating around the villages. Piece by piece, most of the 13 books were being pulled back together in Cairo, not by museums, not by universities, but by the shadow economy of stolen antiquities. And the Egyptian government was starting to notice, because word was spreading. These weren't just old books. Whispers were reaching the scholars now that something extraordinary had come out of the ground near Nag Hammadi, something in Coptic, something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. The first real scholar to chase it down was a young Frenchman named Jean Dorès. He travelled to Egypt, he got access to some of the material, and when he looked at what these pages actually said, he understood immediately that this was going to rewrite what people thought they knew about the first centuries of Christianity. But even as Dorès was working, the collection was still fractured, and one codex was about to leave the country entirely. Smuggled out of Egypt, it surfaced in Europe, and in 1952 it was purchased in Zurich for a foundation connected to the psychologist Carl Jung. It became known as the Jung Codex. For years it sat outside Egypt, a single volume separated from its 12 siblings, a diplomatic tangle that took ages to resolve before it was finally returned. Meanwhile, the Egyptian government moved to seize the rest, nationalizing the collection and eventually gathering the surviving books into the Coptic Museum in Old Cairo, where the bulk of them remain to this day. So the books were saved, recovered, locked away safe behind glass. But we still haven't answered the real question, the question you've been waiting on since the jar cracked open. What did they actually say? 13 books, 52 separate texts written across their pages, written in Coptic, the language of Egyptian Christians, but translated, scholars believe, from older Greek originals. The physical books themselves were made around the middle of the 4th century. The words inside them are older, some much older, and these were not copies of the Bible, you know. They were Gospels the Bible left out. The most famous of them has a name you may have heard, the Gospel of Thomas. It is not a story. There's no manger, no cross, no empty tomb, no narrative at all. It is a list, 114 sayings presented as the secret words of Jesus, one after another, with almost no explanation attached. It opens by telling you exactly what it claims to be, the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke, written down by Thomas. Secret sayings. The word secret is right there in the first line. And some of these sayings sound familiar. They echo lines you'd recognize from Matthew or Luke. But others turn sharply into strange territory. They talk about knowing yourself, about the kingdom being spread out across the world and inside you and people simply failing to see it, about light hidden within a person that has to be brought out. There is no requirement to believe. There is a requirement to understand, and that is the thread running through nearly all of these 13 books. Scholars group most of them under a single word, Gnostic. It comes from the Greek gnosis, knowledge. The people who treasured these texts believed that salvation didn't come from faith alone, or from a church, or from a priest. It came from knowledge, secret, inner, personal knowledge, a truth you had to wake up to yourself. And some of these texts go much further than that, into territory that would have horrified the church leaders of the time. There's a book usually called The Secret Book of John, and it tells a version of creation that flips the familiar one on its head. In it, the God who made the physical world isn't the highest God at all. He's a lower, flawed being, arrogant or ignorant or both, who fashions the material world without even realizing there's something greater above him. The trap of human existence in this telling isn't sin, it's forgetting. And what saves you isn't obedience, it's remembering what you truly are. Sit with how radical that is. Everything the mainstream church was building, its authority, its clergy, its rules, its idea that you needed the institution to reach God, these books quietly stepped around all of it. They said the answer was already inside you, that you could find it without them. You can see, can't you, why somebody wanted these gone, and somebody did. Here's what everyone assumes when they hear this story. They assume the books were hidden by their enemies, that the church found them, condemned them, and buried them to make them disappear. It's almost the opposite. The people who most likely buried these books weren't trying to destroy them. They were trying to save them. To understand why, we go back another 1600 years, to the year 367, and to one of the most powerful men in the early Christian world, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria. Every year, bishops sent out a letter to mark the date of Easter, routine, administrative. But in the year 367, Athanasius used his letter to do something that would echo for the rest of history. He drew a line. He listed the books he considered genuine scripture, and the list he wrote is essentially the 27 books of the New Testament as we have it today. The 4 Gospels, the letters of Paul, Revelation. That's it, and no other. And then he did the second thing. He condemned everything else. All the other Gospels, all the other writings, all the other sayings and revelations circulating among Christians. He branded them forgeries, heresy, books to be rejected, not read, not copied, not kept. Now picture the effect of that order landing at a monastery, because just a few miles from the Jabal al-Tarif, from the exact cliff where the jar was buried, there was a monastery. Part of a network founded by Pachomius, one of the founding figures of Christian monasticism. Monks lived there. Monks who read. Monks who almost certainly owned books like the ones in that jar. And here is the theory that most scholars find persuasive. When the bishop's condemnation reached them, when the word came down that these books were now forbidden and had to be destroyed, someone in that community couldn't do it. Someone looked at these texts, the Gospel of Thomas, the Secret Book of John, all 52 of them, and could not bring themselves to throw them in the fire. So instead, they gathered them up. They packed them carefully into a large clay jar. They sealed the lid with something like tar, and they carried the jar out to the base of the cliff in the dark, and they buried it. Not to destroy it, to hide it, to keep it safe until it was safe again to read. It never was. Whoever they were, they died with the secret. The jar stayed in the ground, the monastery faded, the sand covered everything, and the books waited 1,600 years for a farmer looking for fertilizer to bring his mattock down in exactly the wrong place, or exactly the right one. That's the theory anyway. I have to be careful here because we don't actually know that any of it is true. Remember how I told you to hold on to something? The story you've just heard, the farmer, the gin, the golden flakes, the jar by the boulder, is a beautiful story. It's told at the start of nearly every book on the subject. It has the shape of a myth. A humble man, a sealed vessel, a forbidden secret loosed on the world, and a growing number of scholars think that's exactly the problem. Because when you look closely at where this story comes from, it comes almost entirely from one man, telling it decades after the fact, changing the details every time he told it. 2 men become 7, become 8. The jar sits by a boulder, then beside a skeleton, then inside a cave. Modern historians who've gone back through the records have found the whole account far shakier than it first appears. Some now suspect the truth was less romantic and more ordinary, that Muhammad Ali may have been digging in ancient tombs looking for exactly this kind of thing, that these books may have come out of a burial, and that the poetic, searching for fertilizer, stumbled on a jar version got shaped over the years into a better story than what actually happened. We may never know. The trail is cold. The people who could have told us the truth are gone, and the ones who spoke told it differently each time. And that's a strange place to end up, isn't it? We can read the books. We have all 13. We can translate every surviving word of those 52 texts. We know roughly when they were written and what they say and why the church rejected them. But the moment of their return, the single most dramatic scene in the entire story, the Itaralsat, jar cracking open on a December morning, that moment is the part we're least sure ever happened the way we've been told. The ancient mystery we mostly solved. The modern one, we didn't. So what did these books actually change? Before 1945, almost everything the world knew about these alternative forms of early Christianity came from their enemies, from the men who wrote against them. Church leaders who described these beliefs only to attack them, quoting their opponents the way a prosecutor quotes a defendant, selectively and to convict. For centuries, that was all anyone had. The heretics described by the people who crushed them. Their own voices gone. And then a jar broke open, and suddenly the heretics could speak for themselves. That is what makes Nag Hammadi one of the most important finds of the last century. Not the drama, not the treasure that wasn't there. It's that these 13 books let a silenced version of Christianity talk again, in its own words, after 1,600 years of only being talked about. They show us something the winners of history usually manage to erase. That in the beginning, Christianity was not one thing. It was many. Competing gospels, competing Jesuses, competing ideas about what salvation even meant. And the version that became Christianity as we know it was one current among many that happened to win and then defined everyone else as heresy. The books in the jar are a window into the road not taken, the Christianity that lost. And they raise a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. We think of the Bible as something handed down, complete, settled. These books remind us it was chosen, argued over, edited. That someone, somewhere decided what got to be scripture and what got fed to the fire. And that the difference between a holy book and a forbidden one sometimes came down to who held the power to draw the line. Athanasius drew his line in the year 367. A monk, maybe, refused to accept it and buried the evidence. A farmer dug it up in 1945 and nearly burned it for bread. And a psychologist's foundation bought a piece of it in a hotel in Zurich. The whole chain is almost too improbable to believe. Break any single link. One colder morning at that oven, one more careful police search, one dealer who didn't recognize what he was holding. And these words vanish from history for good, and you never hear this story at all. There's one more thing that stays with me. The jar was buried by someone who believed the world wasn't ready for what was inside. Who thought maybe that one day it would be. That some future person would open it and finally be allowed to read. 1,600 years later, we opened it. The question worth sitting with is whether they were right to hide it. Whether some ideas really are dangerous enough to bury. or whether the only thing more dangerous than a forbidden book is the belief that anyone should get to decide which books are forbidden in the first place. 13 books came out of that jar. We spent decades learning to read them. We're still arguing about what they mean, and somewhere in the ashes of an oven in Upper Egypt, in pages we'll never recover, there may have been a 14th answer we lost forever, the one nobody thought to save. If a story like this is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, the buried, the forbidden, the things history almost erased, then stay a while. There are more of them than you'd think. Subscribe, and let's dig up the next one together.